Hello and welcome. Today I want to share with you a word on the AA steps and, moreover, my experience in working at an addictions rehab facility. I want to go over the process of transformation, the crux of approach and descent versus avoidance and running, and how a descent into the shadow, into those parts of ourself which we'd rather not attend to, is the very source of the nourishment and psychological rebirth. I want to track this paradigmatic schema throughout religion and myth of time and how it portrays in also stories. Now, of my time at an addictions rehab facility, where I work, it's a 30-day facility. And so many of our clients come in and they are off the cusp of catastrophe. They've had some sort of relapse, overdose. They've reached a point in their life where they've hit rock bottom and they need to go to rehab, right? And so these individuals have altogether taken up their addiction for a number of reasons, but the underlying theme of it all is a avoidance, is a escape from the problems of life which they are avoiding, inevitably the responsibilities of life, or perhaps feelings that they altogether are not comfortable feeling, and so they go to substance and these things for an escape from that. And so underlying this whole pattern is avoidance, is the inability to heroically confront that which they should attend to. Now, important to keep in mind is that many people will altogether go in the external world and they'll go and, they'll sign up for fights or go for warfare and these things. But it is the inner terrain and the inner confrontation that is most difficult. And this terrain is exactly the one in which we are navigating in the drug facility. But it is also the one that we each individually navigate ourselves in our own life. And so I would like to take some time to navigate and explore exactly this terrain. And none better place to start than with the AA book. Now, many individuals have their own particular gripe with the AA community or the AA book per se, and much of it stems from that same angst that they carry over from a contempt, a resentment towards established religion, particularly in the state, and so they view AA as such. But to cast AA off as some sort of man-made endeavor of control, and it's foolish. AA was a system built in the fire on the front lines of reality, and so it was altogether constructed from reality, from a dire need for a cure to this peculiar illness which we call addiction. It was forged in the 1920s and 30s, and the opening section, the doctor's opinion, addresses the problem as such. We have this allergy of addiction, and it torments the body. This doctor says, well, we need healing of the body, but this disease is not of the body, but of the mind. Therefore, we must hospitalize these individuals, treat them to a point where their body is good enough to begin the mental work. Many times it is called a quote, moral psychology is needed, right? And as we will dive here, the antidote has been discovered, and it's peculiar. There needs a psychic change. Now, what is this psychic change? Well, let's just dive into the text real quick. Men and women drink especially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that, while they admit it is injurious, they cannot, after a time, differentiate the true from the false. To them, their alcoholic life seems the only normal one. They are restless, irritable, and discontented, unless they can again experience a sense of ease and comfort, which comes at once by taking a few drinks. Drinks which they see others taking with impunity. After they have succumbed to the desire again, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops, they pass through the well known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful, with the firm resolution not to drink again. This is repeated over and over, and unless this person can experience an entire psychic change, there is very little hope for his recovery. All right. On the other hand, and strange as this may seem to those who do not understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had as so many problems he despaired over ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol, the only effort necessary being that required to follow a few simple rules. Men have cried out to me in sincere and despairing appeal, "Doctor, I cannot go on like this. I have everything to live for. I must stop, but I cannot. You must help me." Faced with this problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he lives, although he gives all that is in him, it often is not enough. One feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change. Though the aggregate of recoveries resulting from psychiatric efforts is considerable, we physicians must admit we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. Many types do not respond to the ordinary psychological approach. And so, a psychic change is needed. Now, most peculiar of all, what is this psychic change? We see the alcoholic has many problems of which they are running from, of which they cannot face. And the steps of AA are generally that facing of those problems. So we see the condition laid out in Scripture. Now, Christ is altogether a heroic figure who descended, defeated sin and death, and rose again in new life. He descended into the pits of hell. And important to note is that in the Christian ritual, baptismal ritual, the individual is submerged in the water, death to the flesh, and reborn in the spirit. Now, Christ is explaining this to Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and he goes on and saying a very popular verse, right? "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him, that the world through him might be saved." And now here is this sort of antidote, or this is the terrain. This is the terrain. "He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, And men loved darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For anyone who practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God. And that's exactly it. The individual comes and they have much darkness, and that to confront that darkness, to shed light on it, to shed conscious attention, to share these iniquities in group, and to, moreover, individually confront the truth of things, the overwhelming truth of things that the individual has been running from, that they've been running to this addiction and vice from, that what must be done in rehab is exactly this. It is a heroic confrontation with the inner darkness that is altogether frightening and terrifying, but that upon voluntary confrontation, the individual is submerged, right? These are often emotionally potent uh, complexes. They are emotionally potent memories of which we must descend and recall upon. And that in this emotion, we are washed in the water, we altogether descend and become not so rigid, but, fluid and changing. In that, in this confrontation is the source of life. It's that seed of rebirth that's housed in this dragon that this psychic change comes about. Now we may say, well, there is a sort of, divine salvation, that an altogether inexplicable uh, spiritual experiences that prompt the individual out of their addiction without actually beginning this confrontation. That altogether, as was described above, that all of a sudden the craving for alcohol is gone. And all this does happen. This does happen. What I've experienced is that, well, for the majority of people, this is altogether a wish, that this would be nice if it would happen to them, but that the spiritual experience just described is altogether not accessible to them. And so what they have before them is a dark road of the real work. And that's altogether unflattering, because I'd rather not, but that is surely the case. And so that in the looking at and confronting of these inner snakes, that we find the equal and opposite seed of rebirth. And this is the story. This is a deep story of the heroic descent into, well, we shall say, the unconscious, and it is played out, dramatized in our mythologies from the oldest. But we should look at some Christian symbolism first. Here is a picture of Jonah and the whale. Altogether, Jonah was called on his calling, and he rejected his calling, and that he was on his way running from God, running from his calling from God, and he was swallowed by a whale. Now, if this is not the story of addiction, I don't know what is. And altogether, Jonah in the belly of the beast called out to God and said, I will do your will. God saved him from the whale, from the belly of the beast, right? Here again, we see Christian symbolism of Christ. Christ was often portrayed by a fish. Now, a fish is a sort of an animal that submerges, and that continually submerges into the water and comes up anew, continually dying and rebirthing, a sort of a master of the waters and the underworld, if you will. In a sense, he is a transformative being that cuts through the unknown waters. And so we see this paradigmatic structure outlined in Jung's book, where altogether during the night sea journey, the son god is shut up in the mother's womb and often threatened by all kinds of dangers. he is here speaking of this sort of schema, general schema of the sun god, of the hero that we are discussing now. Instead of using numerous examples, he sets out a quick diagram. The sea journey, it's the night sea journey, where altogether the hero is devoured, where he goes under the water, and that he is altogether, this is altogether a very harrowing journey. He undergoes various trials of sort, and that he comes out on the other side to a landing, slipping out at the last moment. These things, but it is altogether a night sea journey to the pits of hell, of which he is seeking something. Now we shall see that this something is his soul, is wholeness, and is altogether that which leads him to life and God. The structure of the fearless descent into the unknown is outlined in our oldest religions, namely of shamanism. Now, shamanism you can cast out as heresy and begin to shut your ears off to what I'm saying, and fair enough. But when we look at the religious structure, it is altogether at the root of it that before Christianity, man was altogether religious, and that shamanism is a distinct religious entity within the tribal religions that is the same across the culture, that it appears in the Americas and in Siberia and in parts of Asia and these things, independent of cross communications between tribes. So shamanism began in 50,000 or so BC, and it came all the way up and down until around 8,000 BC or so, when man began to create agriculture. The agricultural revolution came about per se, and so there are paradigmatic elements of the religion, of the distinct sect of shamanism, that pervade even our most developed religions now, namely the heroic descent into the underworld and the ascension to the sky. This is perhaps the forte of the shaman, and he is altogether a man of the soul, of the a real practical. That is, he takes the hero and he actually lives it out. He altogether is not just a observer of the story, the myth, but he's an active participant. The shaman is, and he altogether goes into ecstasy, where he has these experiences of the other world, and these ecstatic experiences of the unconscious are generally, that is the source of religion, of much of religion. And here we see it in paradigmatic fashion. And we see the schema in practice in the following seance. The shaman first calls on his helping spirits, usually a bird, horse, or bear. These he will use as vehicles for travel and guidance between and within planes. Such a journey on his own would be impossible. Once ecstasy is achieved, that is, the shaman continuously sings, drums, and dances until he collapses into a state of unconsciousness, where it is believed that his soul has left his body and is in flight. His soul first travels to the underworld. Here he often boards a canoe and travels across a great water before seeing the underworld at a distance. And eventually making it there, he encounters the supreme god of the underworld, Erlik Khan. A retrieval of the lost soul, whereby Erlik often necessitates some form of payment in exchange, sacrifices, or alcohol, by which he gets drunk and tricked by the shaman, who then retrieves the soul. The shaman may also communicate with the patient's dead ancestors, whom may know where the soul is or may be housing it. After the shaman has possession of the soul, he returns it to the patient. Now, this is a descent, a paradigmatic descent, and here we see motifs such as the travels across a great water, the unconscious, where he goes to the underworld. Here he faces dark beings. As here we see these sort of gnomes and the nymphs, and the need to altogether trick or play tricks and get himself by, all in search of the soul, as we see here in further stories. We will see that altogether Gilgamesh is after immortality, that Faust is after Helen, and this altogether represents the anima, uh, and it's altogether in search of the wholeness or the self, the trapped treasure hard to attain in the unconscious psyche, which is altogether at the other side of everything that we'd rather ignore, the shadow. And so we see here that this altogether maps directly onto the descent that the addict is so fearful of, but which he needs to take in order to save his own life. And the salvation does not come from him, but from a willing confrontation and the almost indescribable, but of which we're trying to describe here and now, of the forces which overcome him and that are not his, but are God and are spiritual and are divine and unknowable to an extent, but are portrayed in our myths and our poetry and that which we shall continue to explore. Here's a account of the Epic of Gilgamesh from Mircea Eliade. And so Gilgamesh comes and he is afraid of dying. And so he goes to the underworld to seek immortality. After walking for 12 hours in darkness, Gilgamesh comes to a marvelous garden on the other side of the mountains. Some distance away by the seaside, he meets the nymph, Siduri. That is this sort of feminine character, a sort of mermaid, if you will, and asks her where he can find Utnapishtim. This is the god of the underworld. Siduri tries to make him change his mind. When the gods made men, they saw death for men. They kept life for themselves. Thou, Gilgamesh, fill that belly and make merry by day and night. On each day make a feast, dance and play day and night. But Gilgamesh holds to his decision that Siduri sent him to Urshanabi, Utnapishtim's boatman, who happened to be nearby. They crossed the waters of death and reached the shore on which Untashtim lived. Gilgamesh asked him how he had gained immortality. And so we see this crossing of water, this navigation of various difficulties of initiatory type, right? The sort of temptation of this nymph. We see him run into the boatman who altogether takes him across the waters of death. And he reaches the other side where he comes across Unnatishtim, the sort of the god of the underworld per se, of death, these things. It's the man who was alive after the flood, possessing some sort of unique knowledge and these things down underneath. And basically tells Gilgamesh that he can have immortality, but he has to stay awake for 7 days on end, 7 days, 7 nights. And right away, Gilgamesh says, okay, I can do it. And he falls asleep right away, loses consciousness, loses that attention, if you will. And he's awakes and he gets wind of this and he is altogether crushed. But Utnapishtim tells him of the tree of life, and Gilgamesh goes and he goes to the bottom of the sea and retrieves it, but it altogether he does not capitalize on it, and a snake altogether comes and takes it away, and it ends in the sort of tragedy. And so this is altogether the story of Gilgamesh and his descent into the unconscious uh, after immortality. And so the same paradigmatic structure is in the oldest of epics, a Mesopotamian epic, which was altogether crafted in 5000 BC, and by no mistake is a sort of play off of the shamanic schema of descent. Here we see Jung. Now, much of this is from my exploration of Jung, and Jung sought to discover the universal process of psychic transformation, and he sought to articulate it and turn it into a psychology. In this, he explored world religion, comparative mythology, anthropology, symbolism, all these things which the leading figures of the time threw out as foolishness. Jung dove into and said, well, hey, the the exploration of religion, the religious endeavor by man from the dawn of time was not a some sort of foolish endeavor or wishful thinking, but it was with purpose, and that it has real meaning, that it means something, and he furthered this quest. And so what we see is him taking the line of our ancestors of old and continuing it on into a articulated schema, a theory of psychology, of psychic transformation and whole and development towards a specific end, wholeness, towards God. And how exactly do you do that, right? And so here Jung was a great admirer of Goethe. Now, of Goth, we'll call him Goth. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it. Quotes: I regard my work on alchemy as a sign of my inner relationship to Goethe. Now, alchemy and Goethe's Faust, especially second volume, it is a sort of alchemical epic or drama, and so they're intimately related. You can find a detailed exposition of the transcendent function in Goethe's Faust. The transcendent function. What is this, right? The transcendent function is not something one does oneself. It comes rather from experiencing the conflict of opposites. The transcendent function is this descent into first the personal unconscious, the shadow, all those personal memories that are available upon recall, that are disagreeable, that you'd rather not face, that are emotionally potent, fearful, frightening, but also carry within them the seed of hope and rebirth and renewal. And that the transcendent function of which is this descent of which Goethe laid out in Faust, where Faust altogether descends in search of Helen, the anima, his soul. This is the feminine side of man, and the sort of femininity or the unconscious, the land of the emotions per se, but it is more than that. It is altogether the other half of yourself, that which leads to God. And it comes from experiencing the conflict of opposites. That is, there's a severe discomfort in wading into these parts of yourself that you're afraid of. There's a tension and a sitting in these emotions that is most terrible, and it is most frightening and most uncomfortable. And that is why we tend to avoid these things. It is why the addict runs to the drug, to avoid this very tension and conflict of opposites. But that out of this confrontation and this true feeling and processing of the weight of everything, of your problems, of the whole past 40 years, of which you have an entirety of snakes and people that you've hurt and wrongs that you've done. It is the wading into this that altogether produces the transcendent function that is the psychic experience or psychic change that can wash over the personality and attitude that produces that change of attitude that altogether, you know what, I, I want to live. I want life. To stand in the truth of things and look at the past and to have hope for the future and to be of God and of humility and wanting to be of service to others and not so self-centered, and this sort of change of attitude that is characteristic of the addict, where you just look at him and weeks ago he was altogether in a state of negrito, that he was without life and full of darkness, and now you see him and there's a sort of rejuvenated sense of life, that there's a life force back in him, and this is altogether inexplicable, and it comes with a certain change of attitude, most often oriented around God and His grace and these things. And of course, this is most peculiar. And how do you describe this scientifically or measure it psychologically? But it is altogether real. That individual had descended into the conflict of opposites, and that he had faced what he needed to face, and this water is washing over him, and that's not the water that's taking him under as it would if he had confronted these things involuntarily, but the water of life and of renewal by which the Christian is reborn and by which the individual is reborn. And so this image of Faust really is emblematic of the descent, man, into the unconscious. He goes, he's altogether faced these queer figures, these apes, Satan himself, all after his anima, his soul, the seed of rebirth and renewal of which he's trying to take back to that ascent, to journey back from the land of the mothers. These are all, this image carries in it much weight. All of these monsters that wish to devour him, that are altogether alone, this queer man on his quest for his soul. Much of the epics and mythologies have painted to this exact picture, but it has altogether never been about the external quest. It is the internal journey which leads to life. That is the spirit and not the flesh, the heavenly but not the earthly, of which we are here for, of which our souls and our life depends. Of course, this is altogether, this is what this life is. We're all going to die someday, and it's all going to be for naught. And so this internal journey of the seeking of God and the processing of ourself and the orienting towards the light and the process that comes with that, and development and change that takes a man from involuntarily killing himself, to a path of life and of healing. This is exactly what we are seeing. So these are the first 4 steps of the AA program. These steps, I personally work intimately with the individuals who come into the rehab facility. That is, the first 3 steps can be completed on one's own. The 4th, they need to get a sponsor. and they altogether set an individual on this path. Now, step one, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. This is usually an easy step. They come to rehab, and they come to rehab because they've had a catastrophe, and that they don't want to go. They'd rather be be bopping, doing their thing, drugging, but life has brought them to their knees. Alcohol, their addiction has brought them to their knees, and so they are here. I am wretched. I am fallen and broken, and my life is scattered about, and that I must look at this and say, wow, humble admittance of the truth. My life has become unmanageable. Looking at the snake, okay, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Here's where things altogether get more difficult for the individual. A power, God, I'm altogether resentful of God. There are Christians, they done backstab me left and right, and they're foolish and judgmental, and they use their doctrine for power. And what about the Catholic Church? Right. And so this is very difficult, but if we look hard enough at our ravaged past, at our utter powerlessnesses, and our life in pieces, and our suffering and our pain and our broken relationships that are real, then we must say, well, is there something on the other side of this? There must be something on the other side that is not pain and not suffering and not broken and damaged and not involuntarily killing myself. And so perhaps there's a power and a God that I could reconcile with, and that could bring me to sanity. And that when one has trouble with this, and the third step, to orient back and say, I am in need. I am in need of a savior. Look how broken I am. I need someone else other than me. I need God, because whatever this is, whatever my past and wretchedness is broken and fallen, and I need God. And it's so one can get to this attitude of humble admittance of the truth, and then altogether a dismembering of the pride, and a humble admittance. Well, the pathway is not open. A precondition for the alchemical process was that altogether it is thy will and not mine, and that it is all hinging upon God and what he will reveal. And so it was no different here, that one must willingly lay down oneself a death in order to accept the invitation of God and life and the Spirit. Step 3, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. This is altogether a laying down oneself before God, and it's an ultimate act of humility. And that this step, right, these 3 steps, I'm broken and fallen, I can't do it on my own. Perhaps there's a God out there that can help me and restore me to sanity, a power, and that I am going to give my life and will over to him as I understand it. Not me, but God. And that these are the preconditions for that, the first step of confrontation, that these are required before we take that most perilous step into the pits, into step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. This is the first big step, of which one needs a sponsor. And this is the descent. This is the facing of everything that we wish not to avoid. Now, in our clinic, the confrontation already begins in those first 30 days, where in group therapy and with the therapist, and altogether a reflective time. But to really sit down and write these things out, to voluntarily dig up all those snakes and look at them one by one. This is the descent and the confrontation into all these demons that surround and confront that which we desire, our soul, salvation, God. And so, in this sense, what we see is that these steps of AA are not just some man-made creation of something that is foolish and even particularly for the addict, but it is a shares in a schema that is fundamental to man across time, addict or not, and it is one that hinges upon the crux of avoidance or voluntary confrontation with one's own self, with all the snakes within oneself, of exploration of the shadow, of inner confrontation with evil, your own evil, and that this altogether leads to God, leads to the psychic experience by which heals the addict and is indescribable to the doctor. What happened, doctor? Well, altogether, this man came and he told of this story and this change in him, and now he's with God, and that he has life in him, and he does not have death anymore. He stopped killing himself, and he is living for life and for others and for God and not for himself. How did this happen? Well, one can only observe that, well, this man has life and he does not have death anymore. And that's the truth of things. And it's quite peculiar per se, but this is the process by which it takes place and by which psychotherapy takes place and the whole thing. And it is a complete honor and a beautiful thing to be exploring this in my own life and with you here. And so I thank you. I thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed. God bless.